On February 14th, someone you know will hand someone they love a card, red envelope, maybe a heart on the front, maybe some words inside that someone else wrote for them. 250 million of those cards will change hands in a single day. Roses by the billion, chocolate in heart-shaped boxes, an entire economy that runs on the assumption that love has a date on the calendar. Every single one of those cards will be signed the same way. The same 3 words written by hand in ink at the bottom. From your Valentine. 3 words so familiar they become invisible. You don't even think about what they mean anymore. They're just part of the thing you write, part of the ritual. But those words have an origin. They were written for the first time by a specific person, in a specific place, under specific circumstances. And if the story is true, they were written by a man in a prison cell. The night before the Roman government beat him with clubs and cut off his head. That's the name on your card. A dead man's name. And that's not even the darkest part of the story. But before we descend, I want to ask you something. If you believe the darkest chapters of the stories we tell ourselves deserve to be examined, if you believe that understanding what lies beneath our most cherished traditions matters, you can help by liking this video and subscribing to Late Mysteries. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows behind the stories we thought we knew. Now, let's find out where it really started. Welcome to Late Mysteries. Part 1. The Wolf's Cave. Before Valentine's Day was about love. It was about blood. Before the cards and the chocolates, there was a cave on the Roman hillside. A dead goat and rituals so old that even the Romans who performed it had forgotten about where it came from. There is a cave at the base of the Palatine Hill in Rome. It's still there, or what's left of it, buried beneath centuries of construction, rediscovered by archaeologists in 2007 beneath the ruins of the Palace of Augustus. A vaulted chamber, about 25 feet below the surface, its ceiling decorated with seashells and mosaics and pumice, sealed away in the dark for longer than anyone alive can remember. The Romans called it the Lupercal, the Wolf's Cave. This was the place where, according to the founding myth of Rome itself, a she-wolf found 2 infant boys abandoned on the banks of the Tiber. Romulus and Remus, sons of the god Mars, cast into the river by a jealous king, left to drown in the current. The river washed them ashore at the base of the Palatine Hill, and the wolf carried them into this cave and nursed them with her own milk until a shepherd named Faustulus found them and raised them as his own. Romulus would go on to kill his brother and found the city of Rome. That's a different story. What matters here is the cave, the place where Rome's origin story begins with an act of animal mercy, with a wolf doing what no human would do, with survival in the dark. The Lupercal wasn't just a landmark, it was a holy site. One of the most sacred places in the entire Roman world, venerated from the city's earliest days, maintained and decorated by emperors who wanted to be seen as inheritors of Rome's divine origins. Augustus himself, the first emperor, the man who transformed Rome from a republic into an empire, restored the Lupercal as one of his first acts of public piety. He understood what the cave represented, not just a myth about wolves and babies, but a claim about Rome's nature, that the city was born from wildness and nurtured by forces older and more powerful than civilization. And every year, on the 15th of February, something happened at that cave that would make your blood run cold. The festival was called Lupercalia. It was ancient. Not ancient in the way we casually use the word, not a few hundred years old ancient. Lupercalia was ancient to the ancient Romans. By the time Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, the festival had already been running for centuries. Its origins were so old that Roman scholars argued among themselves about what it actually meant, who had started it, which god it was supposed to honor. Some said it was a festival of Faunus, the god of the wild, the horned deity who haunted forests and drove men to madness. Others connected it to Lupercus, a god of shepherds, a protector of flocks against wolves. Others thought it predated the Roman gods entirely, that it was a remnant of something older, something the people who lived on these hills before Rome had practiced in the dark, in the cold, in the dead of winter, when the world seemed close to ending. The Roman scholar Varro, writing in the 1st century BC, traced the festival back to the Arcadians, a Greek people who supposedly brought the right to Italy before Rome existed. The historian Plutarch connected it to the Greek festival of Lycaea, dedicated to Zeus Lycaeus, a ritual that, according to some sources, involved human sacrifice. Whether that connection was real, or the kind of speculative etymology ancient writers loved to indulge in, the implication was clear. Lupercalia was old enough that its roots disappeared into the darkness of prehistory, into a time before writing, before records, before anyone could say with certainty what it had originally meant. What every Roman agreed on was the ritual, because the ritual never changed. It began with the Luperci. These were the priests of the festival, young men, usually from the most prominent families in Rome, chosen specifically for this duty. There were 2 colleges of Luperci, one associated with Romulus and one with Remus, a mirror of the founding myth played out in living flesh. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar added a 3rd college in his own honor, because that's what you did when you were Caesar. You inserted yourself into the mythology and dared anyone to object. The Luperci gathered at the Lupercal at dawn on February 15th. They brought with them the instruments of sacrifice, a knife, a bowl, strips of cloth, and they brought the animals. Goats, male goats specifically, and a dog. The goats were killed first. The sacrifice was performed at the mouth of the cave. The animals' throats opened with the sacred knife. The blood collected in the bowl as it poured from the wounds. The dog was killed next, an unusual sacrifice in Roman religion, where dogs were rarely offered to the gods. Its inclusion in Lupercalia was so unusual that scholars have debated its meaning for centuries. Some believe the dog represented the wolf of the founding myth, a stand-in for the animal that saved Romulus and Remus. Others think it represented the dogs that threatened the flocks the festival was meant to protect. Others still believe the dog was connected to the purification aspect of the festival. Dogs were associated with the underworld in Roman thought, with Hecate and the crossroads, with the boundary between the living and the dead. What happened next was stranger still. 2 of the young Luperci were brought forward. The sacrificial knife, still wet with the goat's blood, was touched to their foreheads. The blood was drawn across their skin in a line, marking them, anointing them with the death they had just witnessed. Then, immediately, the blood was wiped away with wool that had been soaked in milk. Blood and milk, death and nourishment. The wolf who killed and the wolf who nursed. The entire founding myth of Rome compressed into a single gesture on the foreheads of 2 young men standing in front of a cave. And the young men were required to laugh. The ancient sources are specific about this. After the blood was applied and then wiped clean, the 2 Luperci had to laugh. Not a nervous chuckle, not a polite smile. Laughter. Genuine, full-throated laughter, as if the whole ritual were the funniest thing they had ever experienced. No Roman writer explains why. The laughter is just there, embedded in the ritual like a fossil in rock, preserved from some earlier time when its meaning was understood by people whose names we'll never know. Then the Luperci stripped the hides from the dead goats. They cut the skins into long, narrow strips called februa, the word from which February takes its name. The month we're in right now is named after strips of bloody goat skin cut by priests in a cave. That's the etymology. That's what February means. The Luperci took these strips and they stripped off their clothes. Some accounts say they wore only the goat skin around their waists. Others say they ran completely naked and they burst out of the Lupercal and into the streets of Rome, and they started running. They ran through the city on a prescribed route, a sacred path that wound through the oldest parts of Rome, past temples and markets and homes. The route traced the boundary of the original settlement on the Palatine Hill, the Roma Quadrata, the oldest part of the city, the place where Romulus supposedly drew the first furrow that marked Rome's borders. The Luperci were running the perimeter of the city's oldest memory, tracing with their bodies the outline of something that existed before walls and roads and laws. And as they ran, they struck anyone they passed with the bloody strips of goatskin. They whipped people. They lashed at anyone within reach. The wet leather cracking against skin, leaving welts and marks and the smell of animal blood on everyone it touched. And here's the part that complicates everything. The women of Rome lined up to be hit. They didn't hide. They didn't run. They positioned themselves along the route of the Luperci, deliberately, willingly, eagerly. Some extended their hands to receive the blows. Others turned to present their backs. Young women, married women, women who were pregnant, and women who were trying to become pregnant because the blow of the februa was believed to make women fertile. A strike from the bloody goat skin was a blessing, a gift from the gods, transmitted through the priests, delivered through violence. If you wanted to conceive a child, if you wanted an easy delivery, if you wanted the favor of whatever ancient power the Lupercalia was designed to invoke, you stood in the street and let a half-naked man hit you with a dead animal's skin. The violence wasn't experienced as violence. It was experienced as grace. Think about what that means. An entire civilization, the most powerful civilization in the Western world, the empire that gave us law and roads and aqueducts and the concept of the Republic, built a fertility ritual around the principle that women's bodies needed to be struck to function properly, that the path to motherhood ran through submission to a blow, that a woman's reproductive capacity was activated by male violence, sanctified by religion, performed in public as entertainment. This wasn't a fringe practice. This wasn't something that happened in secret, in the margins, among the uneducated or the desperate. Lupercalia was a state festival. Senators attended. Emperors participated. The entire apparatus of Roman civilization endorsed and maintained and celebrated this ritual for over 800 years. Mark Antony himself ran as one of the Luperci in 44 BC, the same year Caesar was killed. He ran through the streets of Rome, naked and sweating, whipping citizens with goatskin, and then he used the occasion to offer Caesar a crown in front of the assembled crowd. Shakespeare dramatized the scene. It's in Julius Caesar, Act 1, the festival of blood and fertility, as the backdrop for the most famous political assassination in history. But Lupercalia wasn't just about the running and the striking. There was another tradition that some ancient sources describe, though scholars debate how widespread it actually was, and whether it was part of the original festival or a later edition: the name lottery. Young women wrote their names on slicks of clay or parchment and placed them in a large urn. Young men drew names at random. The pairs created by this lottery were coupled for the duration of the festival, and sometimes, according to the sources, for the entire following year. What coupled meant is the subject of considerable historical debate. Some scholars interpret it as a formal courtship arrangement, chaperoned and chaste, a way of introducing potential marriage partners. Others read the ancient descriptions more bluntly. These were sexual pairings, assigned by chance, enforced by custom, with the women having no more say in the matter than the slips of paper that bore their names. The truth probably varied from era to era, from family to family, from one iteration of the festival to the next. But the principle was clear. Women's romantic and sexual availability was a communal resource to be allocated by lottery, managed by the state, deployed in service of Rome's endless need for new citizens, new soldiers, new bodies to feed the empire. Lupercalia survived everything. It survived the fall of the Republic and the rise of the emperors. It survived Nero and Caligula and the centuries of chaos that followed. It survived the conversion of Rome to Christianity under Constantine in the 4th century. It survived the official prohibition of pagan worship. It survived the closing of the temples and the destruction of the old altars and the systematic dismantling of every other pagan festival on the calendar. Every other ancient festival died or was transformed beyond recognition. Lupercalia just kept going. Year after year, century after century, the priests gathered at the cave and the goats died, and the young men ran naked through the streets, and the women lined up to be struck. It was still being celebrated in 494 AD, more than a century after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. 100 years of Christian dominance and people were still running through the streets with bloody goatskin. One of the last pagan rituals left in Rome, stubborn as stone, old as the hills. While every other tradition had bent or broken under the weight of Christianity, Lupercalia endured, not because Romans were secretly pagan, but because the ritual had become so deeply embedded in the rhythm of the year that removing it felt like removing a season. It was February. It was what you did in February. It was what your parents had done, and their parents before them. Back through so many generations that the chain of memory disappeared into the dark. It took a pope to kill it, and the weapon he used wasn't a decree, or a law, or an army. It was a dead man's name. The pope, who would use that name as a weapon against the oldest festival in Rome, was already planning his move. Part 2. The saint who bled the holiday is named after a man, but nobody knows which one because there's at least 3 Saint Valentines, and even the Catholic Church couldn't tell them apart. What they all had in common was how they died. Here's what we know about Saint Valentine. Almost nothing. That's not an exaggeration or a rhetorical flourish. The historical record for the person or persons behind the name Valentine is so thin, so contradictory, so layered with centuries of embellishment and invention that the Catholic Church itself eventually threw up its hands and said, in essence, we can't verify any of this. In 1969, as part of the reforms following the Second Vatican Council, the Church conducted a systematic review of its calendar of saints. The goal was to separate historical figures who could be verified from legends that had accumulated like barnacles on the hull of church tradition. Saints whose existence could be confirmed through reliable historical evidence stayed. Saints whose stories were more myth than history were removed or downgraded. St. Valentine was removed from the general Roman calendar, not condemned, not declared fictional. Just quietly set aside, his feast day reduced from a mandatory celebration to an optional memorial that individual parishes could observe if they chose. The Church's way of saying, we think there was probably somebody by this name, but we honestly don't know who he was or what he did, and the stories we've been telling don't hold up to scrutiny. The problem is that there were too many Valentines. The early church records mention at least 3 martyrs named Valentinus, a common enough name in the Roman world, derived from the Latin valens, meaning strong or worthy. 2 of these Valentines were reportedly buried on the Via Flaminia, the great road leading north out of Rome, but apparently at different mile markers and possibly on different dates. The 3rd was martyred in the Roman province of Africa, and almost nothing is known about him beyond his name and his death. Were the 2 Roman Valentines the same person, duplicated in the records through centuries of copying errors and miscommunication? Were they different people whose stories merged over time, the way tributaries merge into a single river? Were any of them real at all? Or were they inventions of a church that needed martyrs, the way a nation needs heroes as symbols, as inspirations, as proof that the faith was worth dying for? The honest answer is, we don't know. What we have are legends, multiple versions, often contradictory, layered on top of each other like paint on an old canvas. Peel back one layer and you find another underneath and another beneath that, and beneath all of them something that might be truth or might be bare wood. The most famous legend goes like this. In the year 268 AD, Claudius II ascended to the throne of the Roman Empire. He was a soldier emperor, a military man who had clawed his way to power through competence on the battlefield, rather than noble birth or political maneuvering. The empire was under siege from every direction. Germanic tribes pressed against the northern borders. Persian armies threatened the east. Breakaway provinces had declared independence. The Roman military machine, once the most formidable fighting force in the world, was stretched thin and struggling to recruit. The crisis was existential. Rome had endured the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years of civil war, plague, economic collapse, and barbarian invasion that had nearly destroyed the empire entirely. In the 50 years before Claudius, there had been more than 20 emperors. Most of them died violently. The throne was less a seat of power than a target painted on your back. Claudius was supposed to fix all of this. He was supposed to restore order, push back the barbarians, reunify the fractured empire. And to do that, he needed bodies. Young bodies, male bodies. Bodies that could hold a sword and march 20 miles a day and die on command without hesitating. Claudius needed soldiers, young men. Men without attachments, without wives and children, pulling them homeward, without anything to lose except their own lives. The legend says he issued a decree. No more marriages for young men of military age. Marriage made soldiers soft. Marriage made them hesitant, cautious, unwilling to throw themselves into battle with the reckless abandon that empire required. Single men fought harder. Single men died more willingly. A priest named Valentine defied the order. Working in secret, at night, behind closed doors, in the hidden spaces where the early Christian church conducted much of its business, Valentine performed marriage ceremonies for soldiers and their lovers. Young couples who wanted to be united before God, who wanted their love sanctified even if the state forbade it, came to Valentine, and he married them. He did this knowing the penalty. He did it knowing that the emperor had specifically prohibited what he was doing. He did it because he believed that the sacrament of marriage was ordained by God, and no earthly power had the right to prevent it. He was caught. The arrest was inevitable. Secrets don't keep in empires. Someone talked, or someone was followed, or a soldier's new wife mentioned her marriage to the wrong person. The machinery of Roman law engaged, and Valentine was brought before the emperor himself. What happened next depends on which version of the legend you read. In some versions, Claudius was impressed by Valentine. The priest was articulate, passionate, unafraid. The emperor, who respected courage, reportedly tried to convert Valentine to Roman paganism. Embrace our gods, renounce this Christian nonsense, and I'll spare your life. Valentine refused. Worse, he tried to convert Claudius to Christianity. He stood before the most powerful man in the known world and told him his gods were false and his soul was in danger. That was the end of the conversation. Claudius ordered Valentine executed, but Roman law required a process even for condemned men. Before execution, an attempt had to be made to compel compliance through lesser punishments. The condemned was given the opportunity to recant, to submit, to save himself through obedience. Valentine was beaten with clubs, Roman clubs, heavy wooden instruments designed to break bones and rupture organs. The beating was methodical, administered by soldiers trained in the precise application of violence. It was punishment and persuasion simultaneously. Change your mind and this stops. Valentine didn't change his mind. He was beaten with stones. Stoning was both punishment and public spectacle. The community participating in the destruction of the condemned, each stone a vote for the authority of the state and against the defiance of the individual. Valentine still didn't break. On February 14th, approximately 269 AD, they cut off his head. That's the execution behind your Valentine's card. A man beaten with clubs, pelted with stones, and beheaded by the Roman state because he secretly married people against the emperor's orders. But the legend doesn't end with the execution. There's one more piece. The piece that, if true, connects a 3rd century martyrdom to the 4 words at the bottom of every Valentine's card in the world. While Valentine was imprisoned, awaiting execution, his jailer brought his blind daughter to see the condemned priest. The jailer's name, according to tradition, was Asterius. His daughter's name has been lost if it ever existed. Valentine, the legend says, healed her. Through prayer, through faith, through whatever mechanism the early Christians attributed to miracles, the blind girl's sight was restored. The jailer's daughter could see. It was an act of compassion in the shadow of death. A man about to lose everything, giving everything he had left to a stranger's child. The night before his execution, Valentine wrote a letter to the girl whose sight he had restored. A farewell. A last communication from a man who knew he would be dead by morning, addressed to someone he had helped. Someone who would carry the memory of his kindness into a world he would never see again. He signed the letter. From you, Valentine. Those words, if they were ever written, if the letter ever existed, if the blind girl and the jailer and the healing were anything more than pious invention, are the origin of every Valentine's message ever sent. Every card, every love note, every whispered declaration attached to a bouquet of roses traces its lineage back to a condemned man's last words. Your Valentine was a dead man. The phrase from your Valentine was a goodbye. The other Valentine, Valentine of Tournai, a bishop rather than a priest, has his own legend, his own miracles, his own execution. He was also beheaded, also around the same time period, also on or near February 14th. His story overlaps with the Roman Valentine so thoroughly that most historians believe they're the same person, duplicated in the records over centuries. Or maybe they're different people entirely. Maybe there were 2 beheadings, 2 martyrdoms, 2 men named Valentine who defied Rome and paid with their heads. The church couldn't sort it out in 1700 years. We're not going to sort it out tonight. What matters is this. The man behind the holiday was executed. The name on your card belongs to someone the state murdered for performing an act of love. The holiday celebrates romance. The origin is a beheading. We named our day of love after an execution. For centuries after his death, Valentine's feast day was exactly that, a day to remember a martyr, a saint's day. No different from the feast of St. Agatha on February 5th or St. Scholastica on February 5th or St. Scholastica on February 10th. A day of prayer and reflection of masses said and candles lit. Nothing about romance. Nothing about cards or roses or chocolates. The connection between Valentine's Day and romantic love didn't exist. It hadn't been invented yet. That wouldn't happen for another 1,000 years, and it would take a pope, a poet, and a lie to make it stick. The relics of St. Valentine, or the relics claimed to be his, are scattered across Europe like fragments of a broken mirror. His skull, or a skull attributed to him, rests in the Basilica of Santa Maria in Cosmedin in Rome. It sits in a glass case adorned with a crown of flowers, gazing out at tourists who come to see the mouth of truth in the church's portico. Most of them don't know the skull is there. Most of them wouldn't want to look if they did. Other bones are in Dublin, Ireland, gifted to a Carmelite church in the 19th century, displayed in a golden reliquary that gets extra attention every February. In Glasgow, Birmingham, Vienna, Prague, across a dozen cities in a dozen countries, churches claim fragments of the saint's body, each one authenticated by centuries of tradition, and none of them provable by modern standards. The relic trade was big business in medieval Christianity. A saint's bones drew pilgrims. Pilgrims brought money. Money built cathedrals. The incentive to manufacture relics, to claim that any convenient bone belonged to any convenient saint was enormous. We have no way of knowing whether any of these remains actually belong to the Valentine of the legend. We have no way of knowing whether the Valentine of the legend actually existed. What we know is that by the 5th century, the name Valentine was on the calendar. The feast day was February 14th, and the blood of his martyrdom had dried into the stone of church tradition. The Pope, who would use that name as a weapon against the oldest festival in Rome, was already planning his move. Part 3. The Pope's Gambit. In 494 AD, Pope Gelasius I had a problem. Rome had been Christian for over a century, but every February, Romans were still running through the streets with bloody goat hides. The old festival wouldn't die, so the Pope decided to kill it. His weapon was a dead saint and a calendar. Pope Gelasius I came to power in 492 AD, inheriting a Rome that was Christian in name, but stubbornly pagan in practice. The empire was gone. The last Western emperor had been deposed 16 years earlier in 476. Rome was now ruled by Odoacer, a Germanic king who governed Italy with a mix of Roman bureaucracy and barbarian pragmatism. The great institutions of Roman civilization, the Senate, the courts, the military, were shadows of their former selves, maintained more out of habit than function. But the church was strong. In the vacuum left by the empire's collapse, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, had become the most powerful figure in the city. The church ran the charity that fed the poor. The church maintained the schools that educated the elite. The church provided the moral framework that held a fractured society together. In a world where every other institution had failed, the church was the last thing standing. And the church had an agenda. It had been fighting paganism for a century and a half, systematically dismantling the old religion piece by piece. Temples converted to churches. Pagan holidays replaced with Christian ones. The old gods declared demons, their worship forbidden by imperial decree. The process had been brutal in places. Emperor Theodosius had closed the pagan temples in 3091, making Christianity the only legal religion of the empire. Pagan priests were stripped of their privileges. Sacred groves were cut down. The eternal flame of Vesta, which had burned in the Roman Forum for over 1,000 years, tended by the Vestal Virgins, a fire that Romans believed was literally keeping their civilization alive, was extinguished. The Vestals were disbanded, the flame went out, and Rome fell within a generation. Whether you see that as coincidence or consequence depends on what you believe about the power of symbols. The strategy was remarkably consistent across centuries and continents. The church had learned that you couldn't simply ban a holiday. People clung to their festivals with a tenacity that defied legislation. You could close the temples and melt down the idols and execute the priests, and people would still gather in their homes and mark the old days in the old ways, because tradition runs deeper than law. The solution was substitution. You kept the date. You kept the feeling of celebration, the sense that this was a special day, set apart from ordinary time, worthy of observance. But you stripped out the pagan content and replaced it with Christian meaning. The people still got their festival. The church got control of the narrative. Christmas replaced Saturnalia and the Feast of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, which fell on December 25th. The early Christians didn't know when Jesus was born. They chose the date strategically, planting the Nativity on top of the most popular pagan festival of the Roman winter. Easter absorbed the spring fertility rites that had marked the equinox across every culture in the northern hemisphere. The name itself, Easter, likely derives from Eostra, a Germanic goddess of spring and dawn. The eggs and the rabbits that still accompany the holiday are fertility symbols older than Christianity. All Saints' Day was placed on November 1st to compete with Samhain, the Celtic festival of the dead that would eventually become Halloween. The church couldn't stop people from marking the boundary between autumn and winter, between the living world and the world of the dead. So it claimed the date for its own purposes and hoped the pagan meaning would fade. The strategy worked mostly, not perfectly. Fragments of the old festivals survived inside the new ones, hiding in plain sight, preserved in customs and symbols whose original meanings were gradually forgotten. But the church was patient, and centuries of patient substitution had dismantled most of the pagan calendar. Lupercalia was the holdout. It was the last major pagan festival still being openly celebrated in Rome. Everything else had been absorbed or destroyed. But every February, the same ritual played out. The gathering at the Lupercal, the sacrifice, the bloody strips of goatskin, the running, the striking, the lottery of names. Christians participated alongside pagans. The festival was too old, too popular, too deeply embedded in the rhythms of Roman life to simply be banned. Gelasius tried banning it anyway. He wrote a letter to a Roman senator named Andromachus, who was defending the festival. One of the most remarkable documents of the era, a window into the culture war between the old religion and the new. The letter is angry, scathing even. Gelasius mocks the festival's defenders with a fury that suggests he'd been arguing about this for a long time and was tired of losing. He makes a pointed observation. The same Roman aristocrats who defended Lupercalia as an ancient tradition wouldn't volunteer their own wives and daughters to run in the streets and be struck with the goatskin. They celebrated the festival's defenders as guardians of tradition, but the actual participants, the women who lined up to be hit, the young men who ran naked through the streets, were overwhelmingly from the lower classes. It was, Gelasius argued, a festival where the rich preserved a tradition that the poor endured. The senators who defended it did so from a comfortable distance. Their bodies weren't the ones being struck. He went further. He mocked the festival's defenders for their inconsistency. They claimed Lupercalia was essential for Rome's well-being, that abandoning it would invite divine punishment, that the city's health depended on the annual ritual. But Rome had been suffering plague, famine, and military defeat for decades, while Lupercalia continued uninterrupted. If the festival was supposed to protect the city, Gelasius argued, it was doing a terrible job. Where was the divine favor that all this goat blood was supposed to purchase? But Gelasius was shrewd enough to know that mockery alone wouldn't kill Lupercalia. He needed a replacement, something that fell on or near the same date, something that gave people a reason to celebrate in February without the goats and the blood and the naked running. He declared February 14th, the feast of St. Valentine. The date was close enough to Lupercalia's February 15th to serve as a substitute. The saint was a martyr, someone who had died for love, in a sense, if you accepted the legend about the secret marriages. The connection was thin, but it was there. A festival of fertility and coupling replaced by a feast day honoring a man who married people against the wishes of the state. It was elegant, it was deliberate, and it worked. Slowly, imperfectly, over the course of generations, but it worked. Lupercalia faded, not all at once. Cultural traditions that have persisted for 800 years don't vanish overnight, but the official endorsement was gone. The state no longer organized the sacrifice. The Luperci were no longer appointed. The route through the streets was no longer maintained. Within a few generations, Lupercalia was a memory. And in its place, on the calendar, was the feast of a man who had been beaten, stoned, and beheaded for marrying people in secret. But here's what Gelasius couldn't control: the associations. Lupercalia had been about fertility, sexuality, the raw mechanics of human reproduction. The church couldn't promote those things openly. Its theology was uncomfortable with sex, suspicious of pleasure, hostile to any suggestion that the body's desires might be worthy of celebration. So the new holiday became about a martyr, about suffering, about obedience, about dying for your faith. Death. The sex was replaced with sacrifice. The fertility goddess was replaced with a beheaded priest. but the calendar remembers what the church tried to forget. Mid-February. The time of year when the days are getting longer and the world is beginning to thaw. The time when, across the northern hemisphere, animals begin to mate and plants begin to stir, and the long death of winter starts to loosen its grip. The association between this time of year and love, physical love, romantic love, the love that makes new life, was older than Lupercalia, older than Rome, older than any festival humans had ever invented. It was wired into the seasons themselves. The church could change the name on the calendar, but it couldn't change what February meant. For 800 years, the feast of St. Valentine sat quietly on the calendar. A minor saint's day, a day of prayer and remembrance, nothing special, nothing romantic, nothing that would sell a single card or a single rose. Then a poet picked it up and changed everything. Part 4. The poet's invention. For 800 years after the Pope killed Lupercalia, Valentine's Day had nothing to do with love, nothing. It was a feast day for a dead saint. Then, in 1382, a man named Geoffrey Chaucer wrote a poem, a single poem, and he built the holiday we celebrate today out of thin air. Geoffrey Chaucer was the most important English writer before Shakespeare. He was also a customs official, a diplomat, a spy, possibly a member of Parliament, and a man who understood, with the instinct of a born courtier, that the most powerful thing a writer could do was make powerful people feel good about themselves. In 1382, Chaucer was working on a poem called The Parliament of Fowls. It was an allegorical dream vision, a popular literary form of the era in which the narrator falls asleep and experiences a symbolic dream that conveys deeper truths about love, virtue, or the nature of the universe. Chaucer's poem imagined a parliament of birds gathered on a hillside, presided over by the goddess nature to choose their mates. Every species of bird was represented, from the noble eagle to the common cuckoo, and each argued for its preferred partner with the passion and selfishness that Chaucer saw in every level of human society. It was a love poem, but it was also a political poem, almost certainly written to commemorate the engagement of King Richard II of England to Anne of Bohemia. Chaucer needed a framework for celebrating a royal love match, something elevated, something mythological, something that would flatter the king while demonstrating the poet's own sophistication. And in the middle of this poem, Chaucer wrote the line that would change a holiday forever. For this was on St. Valentine's Day, when every fowl cometh there to choose his mate. For this was on St. Valentine's Day, when every bird comes there to choose his mate. One line, 14 words, in Middle English, the first recorded connection between Valentine's Day and romantic love in the history of the Western world. Before this poem, no document, no letter, no sermon, no chronicle, no legal record links Valentine's Day to romance. The feast day was about a martyred saint. The poems and songs of the troubadours, who had been writing about love for 200 years, never mentioned Valentine's Day. The elaborate courtship rituals of medieval aristocracy never referenced it. Chaucer didn't document a tradition. He invented one. And there's a problem with his invention that most people don't know about. February 14th in medieval England is far too early for birds to mate. The English winter is still holding on in mid-February. Snow is common. Frost is certain. The trees are bare. No bird in its right mind is building nests and choosing partners in the second week of February. The mating season for most English birds begins in late March or April. Some scholars have argued that Chaucer wasn't referring to February 14th at all. There was another Saint Valentine, Valentine of Genoa, whose feast day fell on May 2nd or 3rd. In early May, the English countryside is in full bloom. Birds are singing. Mating is underway. The connection between St. Valentine's Day and birds choosing partners makes perfect biological sense if you're talking about the right St. Valentine. If these scholars are correct, the entire holiday may be built on a misreading. Centuries of Valentine's cards and Valentine's dinners and Valentine's proposals. All of it based on a poem about a different saint on a different date that later readers assumed was about February 14th, because that was the Valentine's Day they knew. Whether Chaucer meant February or May, what matters is what happened after his poem circulated. The idea caught fire. Other poets picked it up. John Gower, Chaucer's contemporary, wrote about birds choosing mates on Valentine's Day. Othon de Grandson, a French poet who was a friend of Chaucer's, carried the idea across the Channel. Within a generation, the connection between Valentine's Day and romantic love had spread across the literary culture of Western Europe. The poets were drawing on a tradition that already existed, though not connected to Valentine's Day. It was called courtly love, and it was the engine that powered medieval romance. Courtly love, fin amour, as the troubadours called it, had been codified in the courts of southern France in the 12th century. It was a system, an ideology, a set of rules governing how a nobleman should express his devotion to a lady, typically a lady who was married to someone else, which was part of the point. The knight loved from afar. He worshipped. He suffered. He wrote poems and sang songs and performed feats of arms, all in the name of a woman who is idealized beyond any resemblance to an actual human being. She was beautiful, of course. She was virtuous. She was unattainable. That was essential. The love was supposed to be unrequited, or at most unconsummated. The suffering was the point. The longing was the point. The longing was the art. It sounds romantic. It has been sold to us for centuries as romantic. The origin of everything from Romeo and Juliet to the modern rom. But look at it from the woman's perspective. She didn't choose to be worshipped. She didn't ask for poems. She didn't consent to being the object of a stranger's obsessive devotion. She was placed on a pedestal, and a pedestal is just a cage that's been turned on its end. The entire system of courtly love was about the man's experience, his longing, his suffering, his art. The woman was a mirror, a surface onto which the man projected his emotions, his ideals, his fantasies, her actual feelings, her actual desires, her actual humanity were irrelevant. She was a function, not a person, a prompt for poetry, a beautiful blank screen. Andreas Capellanus codified the rules in the 12th century in a treatise called De Amor, The Art of Courtly Love. It reads like a manual for obsession. The lover must turn pale in the presence of his beloved. He must tremble. He must lose sleep and appetite. He must think of nothing else. The beloved, meanwhile, must remain distant, occasionally bestowing a glance or a word that the lover can interpret as encouragement, feeding the obsession just enough to keep it alive, never enough to resolve it. The woman in courtly love was not a partner. She was a drug, a source of exquisite suffering that the man consumed and called devotion. And if the real woman beneath the ideal ever asserted herself, ever had opinions or desires that contradicted the fantasy, the system had no room for her. She was supposed to be a symbol. Symbols don't talk back. And this is the tradition that Chaucer grafted onto Valentine's Day. Not mutual love, not the messy, complicated, reciprocal experience of two people choosing each other. A system in which men performed devotion and women received it, silently, passively, as objects of worship rather than participants in partnership. The Valentine's tradition that grew from Chaucer's poem followed this pattern precisely. In 1415, Charles, Duke of Orleans, sat in a cell in the Tower of London. He had been captured at the Battle of Agincourt, the catastrophic French defeat where English longbowmen slaughtered the flower of French chivalry in a muddy field. Charles would spend 25 years as a prisoner of the English crown. From his cell, he wrote a poem to his wife, a Valentine's poem, one of the oldest surviving Valentine's messages in the world. Je suis déjà d'amour tanné, ma très dulce Valentine. I am already sick with love, my very sweet Valentine. It's beautiful. It's genuine. It's a man in a cage, reaching across the distance to the woman he loves, using a saint's day to frame his longing. It's also entirely about him, his sickness, his suffering, his love. His wife's feelings don't appear in the poem. She is the destination of his emotions, not a source of her own. The tradition grew. By the 17th century, Valentine's Day had become a recognized occasion for expressing romantic interest across much of Europe. People exchanged handwritten notes. Lovers sent tokens, ribbons, lockets, pressed flowers. The day accumulated rituals, the way a snowball accumulates snow, each generation adding something new to the tradition Chaucer had started. In England, Samuel Pepys recorded Valentine's Day celebrations in his famous diary of the 1660s. His wife received silk stockings and a pair of garters from her Valentine, an intimate gift, suggestive without being explicitly sexual, walking the line between propriety and desire. Pepys himself drew names from a hat to determine his Valentine for the year, a faint echo of the Roman lottery that had preceded the holiday by over 1,000 years. The practice had been Christianized, sanitized, stripped of its sexual directness, but the structure remained. Names in a container, chance determining pairings, the ghost of Lupercalia wearing a powdered wig. In France, the tradition evolved into elaborate cards decorated with lace and hand-painted designs, works of art created specifically for the occasion. The effort that went into these cards was extraordinary, hours of painstaking work to produce something beautiful enough to represent the feelings the sender wanted to convey. And through all of this, through 3 centuries of evolving tradition, the pattern held. Men gave, women received. Men expressed, women were expressed about. Men acted, women were acted upon. The holiday Chaucer invented was perfectly designed to perpetuate the dynamic that courtly love had established. Love as performance, romance as a one-way street, women as beautiful objects waiting to be adored. This was the Valentine's Day that arrived at the doorstep of the Industrial Revolution. When the machines got hold of it, everything changed. But the pattern, the fundamental architecture of the holiday, built on a poet's flattery of a king, rooted in a medieval system that treated women as decorative objects, that pattern survived every transformation. It's still there, underneath the cards and the chocolates and the roses. If you look closely enough, you can see it. Part 5, Blood and Roses. We buried the goat blood and the beheading under layers of paper and chocolate. We turned a Roman massacre of fertility into an industry worth billions. But the violence never really left Valentine's Day. It just learned to wear a different face. In the 1840s, a young woman in Worcester, Massachusetts, received a Valentine's card from England. Her name was Esther Howland, and she was the daughter of a stationer, a man who sold paper and books and the tools of literacy. She was educated, ambitious, and possessed of a business instinct that would have been remarkable in any era, but was extraordinary in an age when women were expected to manage households, not enterprises. The English Valentine card she received was elaborate, lace and ribbons and hand-colored illustrations, the kind of delicate artwork that took hours to produce and cost more than most people could afford. It was beautiful. It was also, Esther realized, scalable. She ordered supplies, lace, colored paper, decorative elements she could combine in different configurations. She hired friends to help her, young women who worked from templates Esther designed, creating cards in an assembly line process that was remarkably modern for the 1840s. Each worker handled a specific task. One cut the lace, another pasted the layers, another added the hand-colored details. The individual card was still beautiful, still delicate, still personal in appearance, but it was produced by a system, not by a single hand pouring feeling onto paper. Her first batch was modest. She hoped to sell perhaps 200 worth. She sold 5,000 worth in her first year. In 1849, money, within a decade, Esther Howland was running a Valentine's card empire worth more than 100,000 annually, millions in today's currency. She had industrialized romance. She had taken the handcrafted tradition of Valentine's notes, personal, individual, each one a unique expression of a unique feeling, and turned it into a product. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Valentine's Day had been a pagan fertility rite, then a saint's feast day, then a poet's invention, then an aristocratic courtship tradition. Now, it was a business. And business, unlike poetry, demands growth. In 1861, Richard Cadbury saw another opportunity. The Cadbury family had been making chocolate in Birmingham, England, for decades. Richard had recently developed a new process for extracting cocoa butter that produced a smoother, more palatable eating chocolate than anything previously available. He needed a way to sell it. Valentine's Day provided the vehicle. Cadbury designed the first heart-shaped boxes of chocolate, specifically for Valentine's Day. The boxes were the real product, ornate, decorated with cupids and flowers and romantic imagery, designed to be kept long after the chocolate was eaten. Women would use them to store love letters and small keepsakes. The box sat on the dresser for years, a permanent advertisement for Cadbury's brand embedded in the intimate spaces of people's homes. The chocolate was the excuse. The box was the product. The emotion was the marketing. It was a stroke of genius that every subsequent Valentine's Day marketer would learn from. Don't sell the thing, sell the feeling. Don't sell chocolate, sell love. Don't sell flowers, sell proof that you care. The product is secondary. The emotion is what people are actually paying for. In 1913, Hallmark entered the market. The Kansas City greeting card company began mass-producing Valentine's Day cards. Printed, not handmade, sold for pennies instead of dollars, available to anyone with a few coins and a desire to participate in the ritual. Hallmark didn't invent the Valentine's card, but they did something arguably more significant. They democratized it. Before Hallmark, Valentine's Day was primarily an upper and middle class tradition. People who could afford handmade cards, who had the literacy and the leisure to write personal notes. Hallmark made it universal. Everyone could participate now. Everyone was expected to participate. And that expectation, the sense of obligation, the feeling that failing to observe Valentine's Day was a form of neglect or indifference. That was new. That was Hallmark's real innovation. Not the card itself, but the guilt that came with not buying one. The commercialization accelerated through the 20th century with the relentlessness of a machine that has learned to feed itself. Florists made roses synonymous with Valentine's Day. Red roses specifically. The color of blood, the color of passion, the color of the goatskin strips that Roman priests used to whip women in the streets. The symbolism was accidental, probably, but it rhymes. Jewelers attached themselves to the holiday. Diamond pendants, gold bracelets, engagement rings timed for Valentine's Day proposals. The De Beers marketing machine, which had already convinced the world that diamonds were essential for engagements, extended its reach to February 14th. Love without a diamond wasn't really love, not the kind that counted. Restaurants created prefixed Valentine's menus. Special meals at special prices for the one night of the year when eating dinner was supposed to prove something about your relationship. The most popular restaurants booked weeks in advance. Couples who couldn't get a reservation felt the absence as a failure, a deficiency, evidence that their love wasn't worth the effort. By the 21st century, the American Valentine's Day economy had reached staggering proportions, more than $25 billion spent annually, over 250 million cards exchanged, over 50 million roses delivered. The average American spending nearly 200 on a single day of mandated affection. The machinery of obligation had become self-sustaining. Advertisers didn't need to convince people that Valentine's Day mattered. The social pressure did that work for free. The fear of being the person who forgot, the partner who didn't care enough, the lover who failed to perform the ritual. That fear was more powerful than any advertisement. The holiday had become a test, not a celebration of love, but an examination of it, graded by the market on a scale of dollars spent. And for those without partners, Valentine's Day became something else entirely, an annual reminder of absence, a calendar date that transformed ordinary solitude into failure. The holiday that was supposed to celebrate love had become equally effective at weaponizing loneliness. February 14th didn't just reward couples, it punished everyone else. The goat blood was buried very deep now. The beheading was buried deeper still. The lottery of women's names, the bloody strips of hide, the naked priests running through Roman streets, all of it sealed beneath layer after layer of commerce, each layer thicker and more opaque than the last. But then there's February 14th, 1929, a warehouse on North Clark Street in Chicago, the SMC Cartage Company. A cold morning. 7 men stood against a brick wall. They were members of Bugs Moran's North Side Gang, soldiers in Chicago's bootlegging wars, men who had chosen a dangerous profession and understood the risks. Men dressed as police officers entered the warehouse. The 7 men assumed it was a raid. They put their hands up. They faced the wall. They cooperated because that's what you did when the police showed up. Even if you were a criminal, even if you had guns of your own, you cooperated because fighting cops was suicide. The men in police uniforms opened fire. 2 Thompson submachine guns and 2 shotguns. The 7 men were cut apart in a matter of seconds. The walls behind them were pocked with bullet holes and painted with blood. Some were still alive when the shooters left. One, Frank Gusenberg, who had been hit 14 times, was still breathing when real police arrived. "Nobody shot me," he said, and then he died. The massacre was almost certainly ordered by Al Capone, who was in Florida at the time, establishing an alibi with the calculated precision that characterized his approach to violence. He was never charged. But the date, February 14th, was not coincidental. Capone understood symbolism. He understood theater. He chose Valentine's Day deliberately because the juxtaposition was the point. A day of love. A day of massacre. Here is my Valentine to my enemies. A message written in blood, signed with the same sardonic humor that the Romans might have recognized from the Lupercal. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became the most famous gangland killing in American history. It shocked a public that thought it was accustomed to prohibition violence. It permanently welded the word massacre to the word Valentine in the American vocabulary. The brick wall where the 7 men died was eventually dismantled and sold, brick by brick, to collectors and curiosity seekers who wanted to own a piece of the violence. Some of those bricks ended up in a restaurant in Vancouver. Others are in private collections. People pay money to own fragments of the wall that caught the bullets. Even the architecture of murder becomes a commodity, given enough time, and it reminded everyone of something that had been true since the beginning. Since the cave and the goat and the blood on the foreheads of the Luperci. This holiday has always had death in it. The saint was executed. The festival was built on sacrifice. The name on the calendar has always been a dead man's name. We covered it with chocolate and roses and 250 million cards. We buried it under billions of dollars of commerce. We convinced ourselves that Valentine's Day was about love. Gentle, sweet, uncomplicated love. The kind you buy at a store and deliver with a kiss. But every layer we've added has been another way of not looking at what's underneath. A goat dying in a cave, a priest losing his head, a pope erasing a festival, a poet inventing a tradition, a woman industrializing sentiment, a gangster choosing the most ironic date on the calendar to send a message in bullets. And through all of it, through every version of Valentine's Day, from the Lupercal to the Hallmark store, the same question never asked, never answered. Who decided what love looks like? The Romans decided it looked like a woman being struck with bloody hide, her fertility activated by violence she was told to welcome. The church decided it looked like a martyr's death. Love is sacrifice, love is suffering, love is losing your head for performing a forbidden sacrament. The poets decided it looked like a man on his knees before a woman on a pedestal, worshipping an ideal that no living person could embody. The market decided it looked like a receipt, proof of purchase as proof of affection, the price tag as the measure of the heart. Every version of this holiday has been about someone else, defining love and selling the definition back to us. The priests defined it, the Pope redefined it, the poet reinvented it, the corporation packaged it. The one thing that's never been at the center of Valentine's Day is the thing it claims to celebrate. Two people looking at each other, choosing each other freely without anyone telling them what that choice is supposed to cost. That's never been what the holiday was about. Maybe it's time it was. The Lupercal cave is still there, buried beneath Rome. 25 feet under the ruins of Augustus's palace, sealed in the dark, decorated with mosaics that no one alive has ever seen properly. Archaeologists found it in 2007 and argued about whether it was the real Lupercal or just another ancient chamber. They'll probably never agree. It doesn't matter. What matters is what happened there and what happened after the layers, the centuries of people building on top of something they didn't fully understand, adding their own meaning, their own rituals, their own commerce, until the original thing was so deep underground it might as well not exist. Tomorrow is Valentine's Day, and I'm not telling you not to celebrate it. Send the card, buy the flowers, tell someone you love them. Those things matter. Those things are real. Whatever the history, whatever the blood and the politics and the commerce, the feeling behind it is genuine. The person you hand that card to is real. What you feel for them is real. But know what's underneath. Know that the most honest Valentine ever written was the one from a prison cell. A man about to die, writing to someone he cared about, signing it from your Valentine. That's the only version of this holiday that was ever real. One person facing the end, choosing to spend their last words on someone else. No goatskin, no commerce, no obligation, just a man in a cell, writing a letter, knowing it would be the last thing he ever wrote. Everything after has been someone trying to sell you something. If this video helped you see what lies beneath the holiday you thought you knew, subscribe to LateMysteries. We illuminate the dark corners of history, the stories that live beneath the ones we tell ourselves. Until next time, keep the candle lit.